All right, moving right along here with Module 8, we're going to continue with sends and returns. We'll start with sends first, and I'm on page 211 in your textbook. This terminology should sound very familiar to us. A send is a mix output of one or more audio tracks sent to another receiving device, such as an external reverb or digital delay. So, in other words, if we're talking about this in the analog world, we are talking about an auxiliary send. They're just not using the word auxiliary in this case. They're just using send. But again, a send is an output. It is a signal that is leaving Pro Tools and it is sent somewhere else, where it is processed and then is usually returned. Although it doesn't necessarily need to be that way. You can send things anywhere, really. It doesn't need to be to an external processor. However, that's the example that they do use in your book. What it does mention to you about the sends in Pro Tools specifically is that you have the ability to configure a aux send in the sends window to be either pre or post fader. So whereas inserts are only pre-fader on aux input tracks and audio tracks, and post fader on master faders, you have the ability to switch between the two with sends. Typically, after you send a signal somewhere, you return it or you bring it back into the mix using an aux input track. Thus the name aux input. It returns the signal. On page 211 and 212, they give you a really nice diagram indicating how the signal flows from point A to point B, beginning with the send output assignment that you would make obviously in your mix window here on any one of these channels. It would then travel out of whatever output you select, whatever pathway you choose, to the destination, and then it would be returned again back to usually an aux input track. So if I were to, for example, just at the very end of my mix window here, I'm going to add two new tracks, an audio track and an aux input track. Okay, and if I were to, for example, to send a signal out of one of the outputs of my interface or even a bus, I would then set the aux input track to have the same input as the output that I had sent. So you see that the signal is leaving on pathway bus 1, it is traveling out of the send, and then it is plugged back into the software under the I/O, the input of the aux input track. And then, of course, the output of that track is then set to the main output so that it is brought back into the mix. Whenever you are displaying sends in Pro Tools, you have a couple different options. First of all, in any track that is able to send a signal, in other words, a audio track or a instrument track or even an aux input track, this is the typical sends insert selector that you will see. You have this drop-down menu where you are able to then send a signal either to a physical output or one of Pro Tools' internal mix buses. You also have these track options, which I demoed for you back in Chapter 10 of 101, and we'll do more of this in Chapter 10 here. But just as a recap, this is your standard sends view. And you are able to also toggle between what's called expanded sends view and what you just generally see in the sends view area. If you hold in the command key and you actually click one of these send selectors, you'll see that I'm able to switch between this expanded sends view. And what you're seeing here now is just the single send level fader that mirrors the floating window that I actually have open over here. So this allows me to adjust my sends on particular channels rather than having the floating window. I can make the adjustments right here. And again, I'm command clicking the send assignment to display that particular expanded send view. To do this manually, you can go up to the view menu, for example, under the expanded sends view, and there are all of the options there that you can see. So you could particularly, if I choose send A, it does the same thing as if I would have command clicked that particular bus assignment. All right, we're going to pick up in a little bit here with using sends and also working with the pan knobs and going on from there. So we'll be back in a second.